System, standing in the name of Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Raitt, seconded by Mr. Carrie, moves that in the opinion of the House, A, rights of victims deserve proper consideration in the criminal justice system. B, the parole system must avoid unnecessary re-victimization. And C, the government should amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act prior to the next election so as to provide victims with an explanation of how dates are determined for offenders' eligibility for temporary absences, releases, and parole. Debate. The Honourable Member for Milton.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of how important it is to advance the rights of victims in a timely manner, I will be very brief in my intervention today, given the fact that we are, of course, in the last hours of this House sitting in this session. Earlier today, I introduced a bill that would make it a requirement that victims be provided with an explanation of how dates are determined for their offenders' eligibility for temporary absences, for release, or for parole. This is a simple change that would ensure victims are given information up front rather than finding out through some other channel that their offender was returned to society. And I should be clear, sorry, Mr. Speaker, I said I introduced a bill. I introduced a bill, and today we're debating a motion. This simple change could save a lot of heartache and unnecessary re-victimization for the victims of crime. And as such, I would suggest that if the government wants to demonstrate that they care about victims, they can adopt this bill as their own, and the official opposition is prepared to support it at all stages before this House rises to ensure that victims are provided with the information that they need. I've waited 11 years to be able to stand here and introduce my very first private member's bill and my first motion on the floor of the House of Commons. This is an issue of victims' rights which is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm grateful for the opportunity and for the support of my colleague, the Member of Parliament from Oshawa, in bringing this moment to today's floor. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. Is the mic on?
There's no light on.
Right? 2, 3, 4?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, but I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleague from Milton. Lisa Freeman is a constituent of mine who has worked years in advancing this motion about the parole system. To give it a little bit of background, Lisa's father was brutally murdered. At the age of 21, she had to go identify her father. This murderer was actually sentenced to 25 years without parole. And Lisa, like many victims, she found out that he was going to be let go early, out of the blue. There was no transparency. And this motion, this bill, is actually a very simple thing that the government could do that would give more transparency to the system. It would treat victims with dignity and give them timely and accurate information. Mr. Speaker, I can't overemphasize how the system is really rigged for the rights of the criminals versus the rights of the victims. And to give an example of how bad this was, this murderer was actually transferred to a correctional facility within 10 miles of where Lisa's sister lived, and she only found out about it 24 hours after the fact when this guy was transferred. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for my colleague is quite simple. This is a very simple change, and it really would give more transparency. This government has run on transparency. Is there any reason she could see that a motion like this, an initiative like this, couldn't get unanimous consent in this House? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, I really do appreciate all the work that the honourable member from Oshawa has done on this file and for bringing Lisa Freeman's story to our attention and to my attention here in the House. I do believe fundamentally that this is something that the government and the rest of the House can pass very quickly as we are standing here today. And the reason being, it's very, very simple amendment to be made, adding one single line, asking for an explanation as to why there was going to be a parole given in the way it was given. I believe that transparency in these matters for victims is incredibly important for them to understand how the system works. In this case, they were part of the system for at least 20 years. And for having the ability to understand exactly at the very end of their journey through the system what happened, I think it's a question and I think it's an ask for the government and an ask from this particular family and many other families around Canada that makes sense, that can easily be done, and I would ask that the government consider it so that we may be able to give some comfort to families like Lisa Freeman's and other families that are experiencing the same confusion and lack of transparency with respect to dealing with the correction system as it currently does.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North, maybe a 45-second question, and we'll have a 45-second
Yes,
answer.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I really appreciate the issue of victims and trying to, over the last number of years, come up with thoughts and ideas in terms of how it is that we can prevent victims into the future. And I realize it might not necessarily be right on topic, but if my friend could just provide some thoughts in terms of how it is that she would see that we could actually take some actions that would, some tangible actions that she thinks individuals could really relate to prevent some of these victims from taking place in the first place.
Honourable Member for Milton, 45 seconds or less, please.
Thank you. And I do think the question from the Honourable Member, and I do think it's a broader and a larger discussion that we'll probably have in the next Parliament, should we be so lucky to be returned to this place by our constituents. But that being said, one concrete thing we can do to prevent re-victimization is by having the government adopt this bill and making sure that it passes into law and makes it to the other place. And the reason being is that you're a victim in the moment, in the instant of the horrendous crime that happens. But you're re-victimized and you continue to be a victim for the rest of your life as the process unfolds through incarceration, corrections, and then further into parole. This one tiny little aspect of at least understanding the reasons why parole is being granted at this early stage would be extremely helpful for this family in particular, and I'm convinced for the rest of Canadians as well. So I hope that the government continues to consider it. Thank you.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to take part in this debate, and I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Milton for tabling this motion.
Given it comes just short weeks after Victims and Survivors of Crime Week. Mr. Speaker, members may know the objectives of that week. The first is to raise awareness across Canada about the issues facing victims and survivors. They and their families must be treated with courtesy, compassion, and respect at all stages of the criminal justice process. Victims, survivors, and their families also have an important role in helping to ensure that justice is done. That during the parole process, for example, reliable and relevant facts about the offender's conduct and the impacts of the offense are provided so that the appropriate decision about parole can be made. The second goal of this special week is to let victims and their families know about the services, programs, and laws in place to help and support them. The motion before us states, and I quote, "The government should amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act prior to the next election so as to provide victims with an explanation of how dates are determined for offenders' eligibility for temporary absences, releases, and parole." Mr. Speaker, I will point out that information about offender eligibility dates is provided to victims already, but I will say that it's always worth examining whether there's room for improvement. Cela dit,
That said, The government already provides timely and helpful information to victims in many ways.
In fact, last week the government announced an important new step, a new victim outreach strategy to ensure that more victims are aware of the information available to them and the role they can play in the corrections and conditional release process. There was a great deal of collaboration in creating this strategy. Correctional Services of Canada worked with federal partners, including the Parole Board of Canada, Public Safety Canada's National Office for Victims, and Justice Canada, in consultation with victims and survivors. The result is a suite of communication tools to inform the public and victims of the resources and services available to them. The tools include infographics, videos, and a social media campaign. Mr. Speaker, another way that victims can receive information is through the Victims Portal. The portal is a secure online service available to registered victims to receive information about the offender who harmed them. They can submit information electronically, including their victim statements. These communication tools help victims stay informed, engaged, and empowered to make informed decisions. Le portefeuille de sécurité.
The public safety portfolio also continues to work to ensure that victims of federal offenders have an effective voice in the federal criminal justice system.
For example, there are now 8,000 victims registered with Correctional Services Canada and the Parole Board of Canada. They are entitled to receive over 50 types of notifications, and last year they received 160,000 pieces of information. Along with more avenues to obtain information and give their input, victims have access to resources such as dedicated victim service officers who provide victims with information about correctional services and the offender who harmed them. Victim service officers explain to victims how correctional planning works and how decisions are made. They provide victims with information on the offender's progress towards meeting their correctional plan. They advise when parole hearings are scheduled. Mr. Speaker, it's fair to say the rest of the motion aims to ensure that victims are treated even more fairly and respectfully by our criminal justice system. For decades, Canada's criminal justice system has been getting better at attending to the needs of victims and survivors. Whether it's a matter of providing information, delivering support, or simply showing empathy and respect. When Correctional Services of Canada prepares an offender's case for a parole hearing, for example, it takes into account the concerns that victims have raised in their victim statements. Last year, victims presented over 300 statements at parole hearings. We're also taking steps to make the parole hearing process less traumatic for victims and survivors. You may recall that as part of the implementation plan for the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights, the National Office for Victims hosted consultations on the victim's right to information, participation, and protection in the corrections and conditional release system. One of the early issues discussed at these roundtables was the parole hearing process as legislated in the Corrections and Criminal Release Act. Under its terms, victims unable to attend a parole hearing can have access to an audio recording of the hearing. At roundtables held by the National Office for Victims, we heard that attending a parole hearing can be traumatic, such that afterwards many victims do not have a clear sense of what exactly was discussed. So why not make the audio recordings available to those who have attended the parole hearings as well as those who could not attend? Why not enable them to listen again at a time and a place of their choosing? That's one of the proposed amendments we have included in Bill C-83, an act to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act to strengthen victims' roles in the criminal justice system. This is just one way we can increase the number of avenues through which victims can obtain information and participate in the processes of the criminal justice system. There is always more that can be done, but we continue to take steps in the right direction.
One of the most important things we can do is to prevent people from becoming victims in the first place.
The National Crime Prevention Strategy provides leadership on ways to prevent and reduce crime among at-risk populations and vulnerable communities. The strategy's goal is to intervene to mitigate the underlying factors that might put individuals at risk of offending in the first place. The Government of Canada is making up to $94 million available over 5 years to develop inclusive, diverse, and culturally adapted crime prevention projects right across Canada. The National Crime Prevention Strategy is another example of this government's efforts to reduce crime and, by the same token, reduce the number of victims. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the government resolves to continue working together with all partners to support victims in any and every way it can.
Once again, I'd like to thank the honourable member for introducing this motion, and I look forward to continued debate on this very important topic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You'll just have to let me catch my breath because I just ran in from another meeting. But, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this motion, the member for Milton. Something that I've noticed since I've been working on public safety is how much of an impact these issues can have on people's lives. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but first of all, I just want to say that I do support the member's motion. In the previous Parliament, we supported a bill that had been tabled at the time. There was we had a lot of issues with the previous government when it came to law and order issues and how we would enforce public safety and protect our communities, and also how we could encourage rehabilitation, because that's important too if you want to meet public safety objectives. In that context, we supported the Victims' Charter of Rights because we believe that you do have to think about the impact that crimes can have on victims throughout their lives. And in that context, there are shortcomings in the current system, or rather the way that the laws are currently enforced and the resources that are made available to the parole board. An example that comes to mind is the legal obligation to inform victims when there is a change to a detainee's status, particularly in the case of some of the most violent crimes. There have been a number of highly publicized cases in recent years that really showed how poorly the law is sometimes being applied. So sometimes victims were not informed. Sometimes they weren't informed in a respectable or timely fashion. And so, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that I support this motion is that I think the government, if it doesn't intend to change the law, and I don't think it does, must ensure that these organizations have the resources they need to inform victims in a way that really meets their official obligations. Certainly today, in the 24-hour news cycle, in the digital era, there are some really terrible crimes that are committed all across the country. Now, I did listen to the Parliamentary Secretary's speech, or at least the very end of it, and I do think that what she talked about was important, because from what I can see from victims groups, it seems like they don't want other families, other people to have to go through what they went through. They don't want them to have to experience the same trauma. So I think it's important to respect victims and to understand that that also takes the form of prevention. Now, of course, unfortunately, there's a lot of work still to do. We know that there are a lot of factors that can lead to a crime being committed, so we need to tackle things like mental health, affordable housing, reducing poverty, because there are people who may be experiencing difficult situations or may have mental health issues, and that can lead them to take a very dark path and commit crimes that have a terrible impact on other Canadian citizens. So this is a scourge in our society, and I think we can all agree that we need to deal with that. We also need to look at the issue of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is key if we want to meet our public safety objectives. It is important. Why? Well, because this is something that is not really popular. There are a lot of tensions within our criminal justice system, and those tensions reflect the need to understand that victims need to be respected, they need to be given adequate resources to set their life in order again and to get back on the right path, and also to feel as though justice has been done. On the other hand, you also have rehabilitation, and sometimes that's less popular. Now, as a critic for this issue, I've seen a number of cases where, you know, the parents of victims are living through really unimaginable anger and disappointment, and that's completely normal. Nobody would say that they're in the wrong for feeling that way. But rehabilitation is not intended to diminish the significance of the crime, but rather to ensure that we have a safe society. A good example of this, Mr. Speaker, is the issue of criminal record suspensions. Of course, in these cases, we're not talking about the truly horrific crimes, because truly horrific crimes often lead to people being imprisoned for the rest of their lives. And often they're crimes where you would never get a pardon in the first place. But I do want to mention some of the statistics because I think they are important, despite the fact that we're talking about different types of crimes here. So 95% of people who had a criminal record suspension never reoffended. 3/4 of Canadians believe that record suspensions that allow someone to reintegrate into society are positive. So, like I said, these statistics don't always apply to the types of crimes mentioned in my colleague's motion, but I did want to introduce this into the debate today because I think that we do need to look at how important rehabilitation can be. Regardless of the severity of a crime, if the system allows an individual to reintegrate into society, then we want that to be done in a way that will minimize the risk of reoffending. And of course, you have to think about the other offenders in prison as well. Sometimes people say that prisons are schools of crime, but that's the type of result that we want to avoid. Now, since I don't have a lot of time, Mr. Speaker, I just want to come back to my original point, I'm going to repeat that I will be supporting the motion, and that we're looking for a number of things here. First of all, we think we need adequate resources to ensure that the current law is applied properly so that victims are informed. Now, if there is some update, because I think there are some shortcomings in terms of the type of information provided, that would be good. And I think that the government needs to study the question in order to reconcile privacy issues and victims' rights. The motion also talks about the time outside of prison that detainees may have, but often that's for medical reasons. Now, that it may be appropriate to inform the victim why that was granted and explain the process to the victims, because I think a victim who is better informed is a victim who can better help put their grief behind them and avoid being re-victimized. So we can look at the bill that was adopted in the previous Parliament and see if it can be updated and applied properly. I think that would be entirely appropriate. My colleague, the member for Elmwood-Transcona, on a different bill this week, made an important point, and I think it's relevant to this motion. He said that often the bills that we pass in Parliament include a review period. So the bill will be reviewed after 3 or 5 years. Sometimes people think that's not important, but I think that it's an important duty that we have as parliamentarians, particularly when it comes to victims' rights. So once again, I want to thank the member for Milton. I support her motion, and I urge the government to take this opportunity to ensure that we're doing absolutely everything we can so that victims have their place in the process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Du débat, resuming debate, the honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start this evening by thanking Lisa Freeman of Oshawa for the creation of this bill. I've known Lisa now for many years, and her public advocacy that has led to this bill being introduced today cannot be overstated. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I delve into Lisa's story and contributions to this bill, I want to make it clear that I will not be mentioning the name of the man who took the life of her father in 1991. It is our job not to give notoriety to people willing to take the innocent life of another. As I was saying, Lisa's father, Roland Slingerland, was brutally attacked and murdered in 1991. Lisa was but a mere 21 years old at the time, and she was tasked with identifying her father after the attack. As a result, the murderer was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility for parole for 25 years, the standard practice for violent crimes such as this one. However, 20 years into that sentence, the man responsible for tearing Lisa's life apart became eligible for early parole for reasons that were never made clear to Lisa or her family. Mr. Speaker, she was not told what her father's murderer had done to earn the possibility of early parole. She was not told why the parole board was considering releasing the murderer that had taken away the life of an innocent man, her innocent man. She was not told why her government would provide leniency to a criminal more than deserving of his punishment. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, Lisa Freeman was never even given a single piece of justification for why her country's justice system was willing to turn its back on the people it is designed to protect. In the criminal code's current state, there is no legislation that requires that the parole board provide any reasoning to victims and victims' families for why the criminal that committed a crime against them is eligible for early parole. Many pieces of legislation protect the rights of victims. As this House knows, Mr. Speaker, there's quite literally a Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights for the sole purpose of ensuring that the protection of victims' rights remains a top priority for the justice system. However, the laws that we currently have on the books simply do not provide the rights of victims to know. The right to know why those who have harmed them are eligible to be released. When a court of law convicts an individual, the justice system isn't just punishing or rehabilitating a person. They are providing justice on behalf of the victim, too. However, Mr. Speaker, when a convicted felon, not meant to be even eligible for parole for another 5 years, is provided with the opportunity to walk freely in public, it is not fair to the victim's family to be kept in the dark as to why or how. Another example of victims in Canada not having the right to be informed is the fact that Mr. Slingerland's killer was transferred to a prison in British Columbia that was only 10 kilometers from the home of Lisa's sister. Lisa wasn't even made aware of this transfer until 24 hours after it occurred. This is just another example, Mr. Speaker, of Lisa being in the same situation that many others find themselves in every day, uninformed. Since then, the killer has been transferred to a minimum security prison on Vancouver Island. This facility has even been nicknamed Club Fed because of its lax restrictions on inmates. Mr. Speaker, this sheer institutional misjustice influenced Lisa to become an outspoken advocate for victims' rights, specifically regarding the rights of victims to know why those who have been inflicted pain upon them and the public as a whole are eligible to be released. She has not only been an outspoken advocate in my community on victims' rights, but has even gone so far as penning her own book to speak about her experiences throughout the entire parole board process, titled "She Won't Be Silenced." It is people like Lisa Freeman that make Canada the greatest country in the world. In the face of utter shock at the early parole announcement, she took a stand to ensure that other people, just like her, would never have to face the same treatment, the same neglect, and the darkness that she was forced to endure as a result of the parole board's sudden and mysterious announcement. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take time to read aloud a statement made by Lisa regarding this private member's bill. Lisa said, and I quote, "Families such as mine are plunged, unasked, into unfathomable situations and then further demoralized and re-traumatized by the actions of a government, i.e. the Parole Board of Canada, Correctional Services Canada, institutions that say they are supportive of victims of crime, which is at best an illusion. After dealing in 2011, when I questioned why my father's killer was granted multiple day passes for a full 4 years before his parole eligibility date, I quickly tired of the scripted lip service and virtue signaling of Correctional Services Canada that purportedly assists victims, but in reality does the opposite. Under the guise of rehabilitation, victims of crime often have to stand back and watch while violent offenders exercise their rights, which, as most victims of crime find, are nothing more than a mockery of justice and basic common sense. It was a quick realization on my part that any rights of the offender was able to access was in fact taken away from my rights, which has been proven time and time again. It is the responsibility of the government to ensure that victims of crime are treated with dignity and respect, and to provide timely and accurate information in a transparent manner. With this legislation, it will avoid providing a sense of false comfort. Families like mine, and indeed families coast to coast who find themselves trying to navigate the system at what is already a very trying time, deserve more, and for the very least, they deserve accurate information. Mr. Speaker, it is because Lisa Freeman that I stand here in the House today to speak to this private member's bill, proposing amendments to the criminal code that would ensure that all victims and their families are aware of how parole dates and eligibility are determined, because the current laws on the books fall short in doing so. While getting tough on crime, in my opinion, is key to creating a safer Canada, victims of crime, especially violent ones, such as the murder of Lisa's father, must not be forgotten. In every criminal case, the two opposing sides are the Crown and the defense. However, it is right and just that the victims not be forgotten. They are the ones that truly suffer at the hand of criminals. In cases such as Lisa's, not only do victims suffer at the hands of the criminals, but they suffer at the hands of the government when they are kept in the dark. Mr. Speaker, the Parole Board grants 79% of day parole requests that they come across. For victims of crimes committed by people eligible for early parole, it's only logical and compassionate that they are made aware as to how those who have harmed them have a very high probability of being released into the public before the end of their sentence. This is truly a nonpartisan issue. Providing a reasonable explanation is not only logical, but it is feasible as well. At this time, when the parole board determines a convicted criminal's date for parole eligibility, they send a document to the victim that was harmed by the criminal's crime. All that is required under this bill, Mr. Speaker, is the parole board clarify why the specified date for parole eligibility is chosen. The potential financial and procedural considerations are very limited, verging on non-existent. This legislation would require that information regarding review and eligibility for all forms of parole be communicated in writing to the offender's victims. As such, victims and families do not have to feel uninformed about those who have harmed them. The written documentation would also require an explanation of how the dates for parole eligibility are determined. It's a simple matter of transparency. Victims deserve accurate and timely information regarding the parole process. For every day that we do not pass legislation on transparency for parole decisions, another victim and another family has come to the realization that their government has neglected them. This bill will avoid providing a sense of false comfort to victims by misleading them regarding parole eligibility. Its purpose is to make parole board procedures more transparent and more accommodating to the rights of victims and their families. This legislation has been applauded by advocates as giving a stronger voice for victims of crime. They will no longer be drowned out by the focus on the convicted. Mr. Speaker, this legislation offers victims the ability to fully understand how and why the justice system is making decisions in their cases, and it's the responsibility of government to ensure that victims of crime are treated with the utmost respect and dignity. To this point, the government has failed to protect the most vulnerable, and it's about time this House takes a step forward to fix that. In closing, Mr. Speaker, above all, Canadians who have suffered as a result of an offender's action don't deserve to be re-victimized by the parole system. The current parole system is guilty of failing to be transparent, and it's the duty of lawmakers in this House to repair the broken system. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, that is why I stand today. I call on my fellow colleagues in this House to support this. I'd also like to thank my colleague, the member from Milton, in spearheading this initiative to provide transparency for the most vulnerable in our judicial system. She has been an honor to work with, and this private member's bill is evidence of her hard work for her constituents and for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for St. Catharines.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to rise today and add my voice to the debate on motion M229. Before I do, and this may be my last opportunity to give a speech during this Parliament, is to say thank you to my wife, Charlene, and my son and daughter, Ethan and Hannah. Hannah will be turning 1 next week, and Ethan will be turning 3 next month. They came after my election. They don't know any different, but they make a great deal of sacrifices like so many other kids to parents who work here on a daily basis. And so it's important to say thank you and to remember them and those who we leave back in our ridings to do this important work. So I wanted to say thank you to them. Also to my constituents for this incredible honour of almost 4 years to represent the people of St. Catharines here in this place. Let me begin by first thanking the honourable member for Milton for bringing this motion forward. If there's one thing in all of this in this House that all of us can agree on, it's the importance of supporting victims and survivors of crime. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize the dedication and tireless efforts of all of those who work so hard to provide that support. We are all fortunate in this country to have a system in place that is there for the people in their greatest time of need. That system spans different orders of government across different sectors. It offers programs and services that support victims of crime so that they can play an important role in the criminal justice system. It works to meet the needs and ensure that they don't suffer in silence. It encompasses professionals and volunteers who work with victims and survivors, helping them get back their lives on track and make sure they're not re-victimized along the way. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the important work of Victim Services Niagara back in my home region for the incredible work they do on a daily basis, or the Christian French Child Advocacy Centre. So many of these organizations across the country working so hard and so passionately for victims of crime. As part of that system, the federal government has an important role. That includes support for victims of federal offenders, meaning those serving a sentence of 2 years or more. The Correctional Service of Canada, or CSC, strives to ensure that victims of federal offenders have an effective voice in the federal correctional and justice systems. Part of that involves providing them with information. Last year, in fact, victims received 160,000 pieces of information from CSC and the Parole Board of Canada. That information is not automatically provided. Victims must register with CSC and the Parole Board in order to obtain that information about the offender who harmed them. But the government has launched a victims portal to make that process easier. The portal provides a simple and secure way for victims to register and access information. It also allows them to submit information electronically for consideration in case management decisions. That includes victim statements, which can be submitted at any time during the offender's sentence. In addition to the portal, victims are able to reach victim services officers by email or by phone. These officers can provide victims with information about CSC and the offender who harmed them. That includes information about correctional planning, decision-making processes, and the progress the offender is making towards meeting the objectives of their correctional plan. Victims are entitled to receive more than 50 types of notification. For example, victims can be notified of the start date and length of the sentence that the offender is serving. With respect to the motion before us, I will also point out, Mr. Speaker, that victims are already notified of the offender's eligibility and review dates for temporary absences or parole. Having said that, there could be room for improvement. And debates like this one certainly help us to shed some light on the issue of ways to support victims. This debate is also taking place not long after the government took steps to implement important steps forward in terms of how it communicates and engages with victims of federal offenders. On May 27th, in conjunction with the 14th annual Victims of Crime Week, the government announced a new victims outreach strategy. The strategy has two main goals. Number one, to improve public awareness about the information and notifications that the CSC provides to registered victims. And number two, to bring greater clarity to certain aspects of the corrections and conditional release system, including victims' understanding of sentence management and the offender reintegration process. Specifically, the strategy will see Correctional Service of Canada promoting the benefits of registration. CSC will also promote the information available to victims through the Victims Portal and the benefit of submitting a victim statement outlining the impact of the offence on them. CSC is working with federal partners in consultation with victims and survivors to develop new tools to let people know about the resources that are available. These tools include infographics, videos, and a social media campaign. That's just one recent step that the government has taken to support victims. It also has proposed a new measure under Bill C-83, which is being considered by Parliament to increase the participation of victims in the criminal justice system. If that bill passes and receives royal assent, victims who attend a Parole Board of Canada hearing will be allowed to listen to an audio recording of the parole hearing. Right now, that opportunity is only available to victims who did not attend the parole hearing. It makes perfect sense to extend audio recordings to all registered victims, not because it would allow victims who did attend the hearing and found the experience difficult and traumatic to have a clear sense of how things transpired. All of these measures are complemented by the government's National Office for Victims. The office provides a central national resource for information and support to victims of federal offenders. It can answer questions about the criminal justice, correction, and conditional release systems, giving victims a more effective voice. Last year, the office distributed more than 6,000 publications to victims of crime, victim service providers, and the general public. And the office helped to point victims in the right direction, receiving calls, responding to emails, and responding to email queries, and referring Canadians for direct services. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to note the support the government is providing to victims and survivors of the despicable crime of human trafficking. In Budget 2018 includes federal funding of $14.5 million over 5 years, and $2.9 million per year after that to establish a national human trafficking hotline. Being from Niagara, Mr. Speaker, this is incredibly important. Being on a border community where so much of that crime occurs, so much trafficking occurs through that border crossing, Mr. Speaker, it's important for our community to have those types of resources to combat this horrible crime. I'm pleased to report that the hotline was launched on May 29th. The hotline offers help and hope to victims and survivors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it's confidential. Victims and survivors will be able to use it both to seek information and receive the help they need to find safety and protection. This includes connecting them to local law enforcement, to emergency shelters, trauma counselors, transportation, and other services and supports. The hotline will also move forward information to law enforcement agencies so that they can take action against the perpetrators. Mr. Speaker, this is only a sampling of federal measures that are in place or on track to support victims of crime. There's always more we can do to make things work even better for them. I'm proud to stand behind a government that takes this issue seriously and that has already taken steps to improve the support system for victims and is committed to working with partners on further improvements to better serve the needs of victims and survivors of crime. In addition, Mr. Speaker, again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of those involved in victim services. It is an incredibly difficult job to help people through the trauma that they experience. We talk a lot about first responders and the important work that they do, but victim support workers provide a significant component of that next step that too often is forgotten about, but the work is important to help get people on the right track, to help them move forward. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them. Again, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Milton for introducing the motion and spearheading this important debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's important that we recognize that victims of crimes do play a very important and crucial role in the whole process, Mr. Speaker. You know, we had a very sad story not that long ago in Winnipeg North. Had an impact. When I say Winnipeg North, I'm not talking necessarily the riding of Winnipeg North. It was in the inner city north end of Winnipeg, where we had a very young man that was at home with his grandmother, and someone had broken into the home, and the young man ended up to be stabbed and ultimately died, Mr. Speaker. This really touched a lot of emotions in the city of Winnipeg. It had a fairly profound impact with the amount of attention that it gathered as people rallied around the family. The individual deceased young man was supposed to be graduating this month from Techvoc High School. And, you know, there were a series of public meetings that followed. The victim here was of Filipino heritage. And I say that primarily because the community, in particular the Filipino heritage community, really came to support the mother and father, both of which I've known for many years. And I relaying this message to the House today because throughout the process, time after time, you meet with individuals that followed the story. And what people really wanted were answers to a series of different questions, from everything from why did it happen, what were the circumstances, what about the perpetrator, the individual that caused the harm, And it's really difficult for us to try to provide the answers that they're really looking for. And I'm thinking of the family members. You know, for me, it was difficult as I attended the meetings, and you know, I think of Imelda in particular, a dear family friend, and the emotions that are involved. And it really heightens the importance that, sadly, we have a lot of crimes that take place in our communities in which these victims, and it's not just the deceased, it's the family members and friends of these victims that need to have some form of understanding in terms of what has taken place and a sense of justice. I sat on a Justice Committee for Youth for many years. In fact, I was the chair of the Keewatin Youth Justice Committee for a number of years. And we talked a great deal about the importance to ensuring that there's a consequence to inappropriate behavior, or for young people that are breaking the law, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that I felt pretty good about was the fact that as a committee, more and more we were looking at ways in which we could see restorative justice put into place. Restorative justice where you get victims actually meeting with these criminals or the individuals that have caused the problem, and you try to come up with a disposition in which it provides some sense of justice to the victim. Now, obviously, there's a huge difference when you steal something or there's a relatively minor offense compared to a victim where someone actually dies, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, that's night and day. But the point is that when we think of victims, I have, through the years, going back to the chair of the Justice Committee, the Keewatin Justice Committee, to the days in which I was the critic for justice in the province of Manitoba, have always believed that there needs to be a consequence to individuals that break our laws. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we need to be aware that those victims also need to be taken into consideration. You know, we had legislation where we reformed our military laws in the last couple of years. And I remember speaking on that, where I highlighted that one of the aspects of the legislation that I appreciated is that we were incorporating within that legislation rights for victims. Now, I can't remember all of the details of it, Mr. Speaker, not offhand, but the principle of recognizing and appreciating the need to have victims as a part of the process is something in which we, as government, or in particular the minister, has taken very seriously. You know, there's a couple of points that I wanted to highlight. You know, one of was the fact that as a government that we did launch a communication and outreach strategy to provide victims with greater awareness of what services are available and how they can actually access them, Mr. Speaker, which I think is of great importance. We are in consultation with victims and the Federal Ombudsman for victims of crime, recognizing that we can and should do better. I want to cite another piece of legislation that we had actually passed, Mr. Speaker, where imagine you were a victim of a sexual assault, and you decide that you're going to be going to listen to the hearing for the person to ultimately be released, parole hearing. And you can only imagine the state of mind that that victim would be in while they listen to this parole meeting. Well, under the legislation that we actually passed in the last, again, maybe last year, we allowed for the victim to actually receive an audio recording that she or he would ultimately be able to listen to from the proceedings. Now, I would suggest to you that whether it's the enshrinement of victims' rights when we did the military reform, or this example that I just finished using, are tangible examples where we have a government that is in fact moving. Now, I think that all of us on all sides of this House would recognize at times that there is always room for us to improve and do better. I don't think that there's any one of us that cannot appreciate the importance of ensuring that victims do have an important role and need to be recognized through this process, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that whenever I've had the opportunity to address an issue such as this, and I brought it up to the member earlier, Mr. Speaker, was the question of the best way for us, I believe, to continue to move forward is to also look at ways in which we can prevent victims in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And that's one of the things in which I really do believe as a government that we have been very successful through a multitude of different grants and budgetary measures to legislative measures that I think will in fact make a difference. If I go just to Winnipeg North, the area that I represent, just as an example, where we now have in some of the more challenging areas along Selkirk Avenue, a 7-day, 24-hour drop-in center where we actually get individuals, Mr. Speaker, that I believe by getting engaged and being involved at that drop-in center or being involved with the Bear Clan, that you're seeing less crime ultimately that is taking place in our communities, Mr. Speaker. That is something else that I'm very much interested in, and I look forward to continuing to have the dialogue in terms of what it is that we can do in government to deal with ensuring that victims are being taken into consideration in all legislative and budgetary issues that government presents to the House, because it's important. It really does matter, Mr. Speaker. And as in the past, I always appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts on important issues that Canadians have to face.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Niagara Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to stand in the House today to speak on this very important issue. And I do have to say, a pleasure to today have my Métis jacket on in celebration of Indigenous Month, as well as just around the corner from Aboriginal Day coming up this Friday. Mr. Speaker, as was very well articulated by the member to my right, the Winnipeg North, the member from Winnipeg North, how important it is that victims have an important role in the criminal justice system, and that we are listening to their concerns on a regular basis to ensure that, once again, that they become and have a further role in the criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to ensuring that victims of crime are supported, informed, and respected, especially with taking into consideration what they go through. And of course, that doesn't end. It sometimes continues, and of course, needing supports as well. From those supports, well-informed, as well as a government that takes into consideration the respect that they fully deserve is very important. The Correctional Services of Canada, as well as the Parole Board of Canada and the National Office for Victims, work together, Mr. Speaker, to provide victims the information that they are entitled to. We have, Mr. Speaker, launched communication and outreach strategies to provide victims with greater awareness of what services are in fact available and how to access them, and how important that is, Mr. Speaker. We often, as government, do find ourselves with our constituents informing them and making sure that they are well advised with respect to the many services that the federal government has for them, a menu of services, and this being no different, Mr. Speaker. We will continue engaging with victims and the federal ombudsman for victims of crime to continue, Mr. Speaker, strengthening victim services and, of course, the supports that they well deserve as well as expect. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Niagara Centre will have 7 minutes and 58 seconds coming to him should this bill come back. The time provided for the consideration of this item of private member's business has now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper.